Hi, welcome to the second IIT special episode. I am your host, Mike. I'm a first year PhD student from Monash. My supervisor is now Suchia. Kallum.
My name's Kallum Robinson. I'm a former student contributing researcher with now Qianchen, also at Monash University.
Well, guess what? I'm also now PhD student. My name is Qianchen.
My name is Matteo Grasso. I work as a researcher at UW-Madison, Wisconsin in the Tononi lab, and I am a visiting postdoc at ATR in Japan, working with now Tsuchiya.
My name is Francesco Ellia. I'm a visiting researcher postdoc at the ATR in Japan under the supervision of Nao Tsuchiya.
Oh yeah, I'm also at ATR. Yeah, I'm a visiting, I'm an intern student at ATR, and well, my main job is the PhD student of now Tsuchiya. Anyways.
All right. So today the paper we are going to talk about is The Unfathomable Richness of Seeing, authored by Haun and Tononi in 2024. Now, the paper opened by introducing us to sort of an age-old debate in the cognitive, I suppose in psychology in general. It's on the question about whether we have a rich visual experience or do we have a sparse visual experience. Now, intuitively, just as a layman, we feel like our visual experience is often quite rich. Look around your own room, there are plenty of different objects, all have different shapes, different colors, different textures. We see light, we see shadows, we see a lot of things. But many cognitive psychologists have disagreed with our intuition. Because when you actually ask the people to report on some of the visual experience they had, all of a sudden they often confabulate, they make mistakes, or they just fail to report. Therefore, they concluded, based on experiments such as change blindness and so on and so forth, they conclude that perhaps we don't see that much. And our intuition that we actually see a lot is merely some sort of illusion, or perhaps it's some sort of summary statistic like GIST, rather than actually seeing all the objects in our visual field. The author of this paper sort of, in a sense, disagree with the sparse view of our visual experience. They, much like many of IIT's claims, it can be counterintuitive at times. They also making a novel claim in this paper. They are saying that even if you are looking at a blank white canvas, nothing on it, you're actually having an incredibly rich visual experience in the structural sense. Now, what does that mean? Well, we first have to understand what the hierarchy that they are trying to propose in this paper. They're essentially saying that we require lower level features. We need to see them first before we can be able to identify and notice these higher level categories. For example, if you're thinking about a face, you need to see its individual features, the mouth and the eyes, so on and so forth, to actually be able to put together this face, the higher level categorization at the end. Now, it's true that some lower level feature can be altered without altering the higher level features. A face can have different mouths, different eyes, but at the end of the day, it's a face. The opposite is sort of true for lower level features. Lower level features can exist independent of higher level features. But of course, you have to see the lower level features first to be able to attempt to even notice the higher levels. Now, so far, it's not that novel of a hierarchy. More traditional cognitive scientists have proposed things that are kind of similar. What is interesting, however, is when we are asking ourselves, what's the bottom of this hierarchical pyramid, what underlies all visual experience. And that's when we get to this very interesting point, where when we are looking at a blank canvas, we actually see a lot of things. Now, if I may, I will share my screen for a very specific graph. Oh. Now, imagine blank canvas. You can find, let's say, 2 random spots, locations in this canvas. Now, in the picture, it's marked out by these black dots, but in reality, they don't have to be. You can just randomly choose spots. That's fine. You will quickly notice that there is a space between these chosen spots, a space in between. And this space is in fact made up of sub-regions that are either closer to one of the pre-chosen location or another. And of course, you can further divide these regions into even smaller sub-regions, so on and so forth. And we also notice there are overlaps between these regions, and there are in fact a greater regions outside of these dots we have chosen that sort of overlap the entire region. Based on these experience, or rather insights into the qualitative properties of space, the theory concludes that, in fact, if we are thinking about the structure of this blank space, it's actually very complex and rich. So in that sense, even with a blank space, we actually have a very rich experience. At the end, the authors of this paper concluded that the reason why the sparse view exists is because the traditional cognitive psychologists focus too much on the equivalence between notice an object and having a visual experience of that object. And they are focusing too much on the reportability of these higher level categories, while ignoring the actual qualitative properties that underlines our visual experience. And that's sort of the rough summary of this paper. I know it's very vague on a lot of points. I can't really go into detail of some of it. But any topics that we want to discuss at this moment?
So I think it's a very good summary, and because it points out that this space is the fundamental of our visual experience. Having experience is first of all is to have a spatial canvas structure like experience. And I think one thing to kind of extend on that in terms of the richness and sparseness debate so far is that you mentioned that the sparseness view claim that we don't see much based on, you know, the fact that we fail to report a lot of otherwise highly noticeable things in the stimuli or something like that. And interestingly, the conventional richness side of this debate actually also follow the assumption that richness is measured by these reportable things, and the richness claim was actually just like, no, we can actually see more objects than we can report. So it is still ignoring this fundamental spatial structure aspect of our experience. And the most novel thing about this paper itself is to ground the richness into the space structure, so that even with the blank screen is highly rich because of this structural property of the space.
Yeah, I think or can I add something to that, or just to maybe pose a question on this? I think not to take a side on that debate, I feel kind of unsatisfied by this figure 8 or this kind of description. And I think like maybe it comes from just the way that it's constructed. Like if you imagine a blank canvas, or I think the author asks you to consider a blank wall or a white canvas, and to pick out points on that wall and relate them in space. I think so long as that wall has a sort of texture, or there's a detail to it in any way, it's much easier to position these imaginary dots in space. But if you imagine a truly absent visual experience, I'm not sure if it's very hard to get one, but I know for myself, I've been in a cave once that's pitch black, no light, absolutely no light, such that you can't see your hand in front of you at any distance. It's just pure black. And I'm getting an understanding of space in that situation, phenomenologically, from my perspective, is very difficult. It's very hard to imagine like the world out in front of you or get a sense of physical space. And I think in those situations, I would really struggle to imagine where these dots are in space and the way in which they overlap in a way that I think is like much more difficult than if you close your eyes, because there's always still some light coming through the eyelids. There's always kind of features in visual space that you can relate things to implicitly. But I think this would just be very difficult in a truly absent visual experience to do this sort of relational experiment to understand the structure of visual space.
I want to comment on that. And it's interesting that you said twice you talked about absence of visual experience. And that is exactly what I would argue. It's not the case, right? Because if it was an absence of visual experience, you wouldn't even be seeing black, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So, but it is absence of, in this case, any low-level feature, any grouping, any object. It would just be an experience of pure space, according to IIT. So this said, though, I definitely agree with you that it is much, much, much harder to do this experiment when you are in a cave, when there is not even the little, colors that you see when you close your eyes. Because somehow the idea is that your ability to introspect the space is also the one that you can use to realize that you could be seeing a dot here or there, and you could see a spot this big in the top left quadrant or lower level, low right quadrant, right? So when you are in a cave, maybe that's harder. But I think it's still possible for you to imagine. I mean, to me, that happens when I am looking at a very dark sky and somebody tells me there is a star there they're looking at. And I'm like, I don't see it, but somehow with my attention, I can search, right, for it. And I can imagine that it can be there or there or there. So in that case, it means that I must be somehow experiencing a canvas that I can, survey. And I think the idea is just a metaphor, of course, but the idea is that in the cave you could be doing something similar.
I guess what can I quickly just say? I think in those experiences, though, if you've had one, I think pilots also. I've also flown some light aircraft, and when you get stuck in a cloud, for example, your spatial relation is like it is quite disorientating spatially. Those experiences, like your conception of what's in front of you is, I don't know, I find much more collapsing than if you're lying on your back looking at a dark sky still. I know I'm only nitpicking on there to make it a sort of point of discussion, but I do see what you
actually a different point, because one thing is to know your position in space, and another thing is to experience space or having a spatial experience, right? So the fact, absolutely, like when you, for example, when you how do you say, like when you submerge in water, when you dive right into water, sometimes it can be very confusing if you if you lose what's the upside and downside, and actually people drown for that even without much water sometimes. So absolutely. But the fact that you still have a spatial experience in front of you. So as Matteo said, like very simply, even if you don't want to focus on very tiny dots, just imagine like one region of your visual field and another region and another region. And those regions, no matter how big or small, they are still related in some specific way. It's not just random bits of experience or sensory a feeling coming at you. So I think the the hard part, like the difficult thing to understand about this paper and the space paper that came out in 2019 is precisely that we are not talking about like advanced or complicated feature of space and how to move into space and how to relate with space, but we're talking about the fabric, so to say, of experiential space itself. So it's something like so fundamental that probably we overlook it most of the time in our everyday experience. That's what I would say.
And also, just to add on that, I feel like Kallum's definition of space slightly differs from IIT's sense of space. So from your flying example, it seems to me that what you mean by space is actually this, our like a three-dimensional space, right? Like you have an XYZ, the coordinates to define your location. But I think IIT's space is just this extendedness. So it goes this way. It doesn't include the depths of your experience. So there's no third dimension to it. So it's just this. And there are some thoughts on the fabric. And the fact that in the cave, you feel like you are wrapped up or enveloped by darkness is exactly because that experience is spatial. It is extended so that you can be wrapped up.
Nice. Yeah.
So there is one thing I wanted to bring up, if that's okay. I like the summary a lot, and also how it was supplemented by Qianchen. So to me, you went straight to the point that even just experiencing space for IIT is already pretty rich, and so the fact that you're experiencing space is already showing that you are seeing your experience of seeing is very rich, even if you can't maybe notice as much. But I think this paper is interesting also because it connects the issue that Qianchen mentioned of distinguishing noticing and seeing, and telling you that usually richness is judged based on what you can notice and what you can report. But when you actually consider what you must be seeing in order to even report one little thing and therefore notice it must be a lot. And it's not only that you must be seeing space, which is already very rich, but that when you see an object, the fact that you are seeing an object means that you are seeing the groupings of low-level features. And it means that you're seeing a lot of low-level features. And if you're seeing low-level features, it means that you're seeing them in space. So I think this paper is interesting because it connects this idea that I agree with Kallum's well, in a sense, skepticism, or it's very hard to appreciate the richness of space when it is sort of considered on its own. But when you actually add the object dimension and the low-level features and the groupings and all the things that you can see in space, then you can start reasoning, well, to see an object, I must see all its components. To see all the components, I must be seeing a lot of pixels, colored pixels and edges, and they must be located in space somewhere, so there must be a canvas. So maybe you can appreciate the richness at different depth a little more. So I think this paper complements nicely because it doesn't just reiterate that space must be very rich, but also when you see things in space, well, that adds even more richness, like, to your experience.
Yeah, and I like I definitely don't disagree with it. I think that like that it's a very convincing argument. I would agree about the richness of experience, especially the end. I think something the way that the author sums it up, that you're kind of looking through it all the time and you don't see it. I think that is a very nice and sort of intuitive way of explaining it. I was more just kind of get a handle on that particular way of justifying it.
Actually, I do sort of have a question regarding perhaps more on the methodology side, because traditionally one of the critiques from the sparse view to the rich view is that noticeability, reportability, access, whatever you call it, is sort of an important aspect of how we conduct experiment at the moment. And it almost seems unimaginable to completely separate the two. So I just wonder what sort of general direction we can take to really investigate these sort of visual experience without necessarily considering the noticeability and reportability.
Can I start with a rather philosophical remark, and maybe someone will say on the more empirical side of it. But I think it's very important to remember that when Ned Block introduced the differences between access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness, he was extremely explicit, like it's literally in the first page of the paper, that access consciousness is not consciousness, it's not experience per se. Admittedly, the name is a bit misleading because it's literally called access consciousness, right? But he was very explicit about that. So I think that we should really keep this distinction well in mind, that when we talk about experience, we're talking about phenomenal consciousness, and then the fact that you can access part of that phenomenal experience. It doesn't, it builds on it, but it shouldn't conflate it with it. That's my take on that.
Mm.
And I guess on the methodological side, let me think about this. So, there are a few points that this paper mentioned. There's this one point, which is not necessarily on space, but the fact that you have intermediate level groupings, and then higher level. I don't like to use the word, but representations, where you can use words to name the stuff you see, right? But that's, for this paper stance, is a very high level thing that does not necessarily have to accompany with a rich experience. And here I would like to market or advertise for my stage 1 register report preprint. So my and I'm running this experiment where I have this paradigm to test whether people experience things that they do not have words for, or if there are any qualities in the visual experience that we simply cannot express with words. And yeah, so basically in the paper, I basically alter the little textures of the images without distorting the overall gist of the scene. And if people can still distinguish between the alterations, then it means something about these altered images that is differ from the intact, and then it just cannot be put into words. So something like this can be done. And as for the this space aspect of it, I think Giulio mentioned that they have papers, they have experiments by asking people to distinguish between two locations in the periphery, and then they just like show like light up like the little locations and ask them to distinguish between the locations of the dots. And yeah, you can do something like that experimentally, but I feel like the idea of space is, in this sense, is quite intuitive at the same time. So you don't necessarily need to exhaustively kind of and then experimentally verify all the locations, all the relation, all the distinctions there are to be able to prove your point.
Yeah, certainly. I feel like this, I think before we started the recording, I think what Qianchen mentioned is in many ways correct, that this paper is moving sort of above and beyond the traditional debate in that sense. Because in traditional rich view, per se, whatever they do, the sparse view proponent can always just say, oh, it's some form of access, even between choosing two pictures or identifying between locations. It's still some form of access involved. So all scientific investigation into the topic necessitates some form of the participant report. It's inevitable. But now we actually move beyond just how many objects can we see and into the richness of the structure. I think some of these old debates, so we can sidestep them. I think that would be very interesting, but still, yeah, I'm not entirely sure what the exact methodology would be in this case, nonetheless. But still, nonetheless, interesting.
Just to add on that, I think another paper that they talk from Andrew Haun, it's a 2017 paper, Are We Underestimating the Richness of Experience? A very important point that they point out is that report access can be used as a method to probe the experience, but one of the reasons why these previous studies always claim that it's sparse or like its richness lies in 2 or 3 objects, it's because they ask only the objects, like the high level things, right? If you make the report method more sophisticated to be able to reveal this lower level things, then you will be able to reveal more things. But still, I think their stance would be, even so, there's still something that you simply cannot put into words. But you can expand the repertoire of report by probing people in a way that is smarter and more flexible.
And connected to that, I think one very fascinating aspect of this paper for me was to show how easily higher level description or summary description can be highly underdetermined, right? And in a sense, this doesn't make much sense because like specifically figure 5, I think. Yes, figure 5 on page 9. It's very interesting because sure, you could make the same description for this picture as a gorilla within a dense foliage or whatever. But when you experience each of these pictures separately, they're clearly very different. And it's not just a difference, I would say, in the lower level feature, but the picture itself is rather different. For example, in 4 of the pictures, the face is rather simplified, while 2 other pictures are very expressive, and the expression changes quite a lot. And for sure, you could say, as they claim in the description of the figure, that you can simply refine the description a little bit. So maybe just a portrait of the face of a gorilla within some foliage, and that probably will discard the other 4 pictures. But then again, you could easily, as they claim, create countless actually pictures that respect this higher level description, but constitute a quite different, maybe not radically, but a quite different subjective experience of the picture themselves, right? And essentially, you could go on virtually at the infinite until one point you will have to describe the location of each individual pixel that appears in the picture itself, right? And which basically kind of collapse the entire idea of a summary description. So I think this figure is extremely powerful in conveying one of the main ideas of the paper, that there is a radical difference between what we can report or what we report and what we actually experience subjectively, regardless, whether we take into account the richness of the experience itself, but just this radically different modality of reporting versus experiencing.
I also maybe I want to point out some things from a slightly different angle that I think might be worth saying, just to answer your question on, in a sense, can we really move away from report or reportability? And I don't think the message is that we should move away from, right? Like that's a key, crucial tool that is necessary for scientific investigation of consciousness. But I think there is a section in the paper that is called, if I remember correctly, something like, so why, if what we see is an extraordinarily rich structure, where does the idea that seeing is sparse come from? So I think that section is very short, and it mentions what Kallum said, that mostly it's probably because we're always immersed in space. We also see space, we sort of see through it, and so we don't realize the richness. But I think there is, if we dig a little more, and maybe we can make a more general consideration about consciousness science, is that consciousness is paradigmatically private, right? And there has been thousands of years, or at least centuries, of a scientific and philosophical debate on whether we can study consciousness scientifically, precisely because it is private. And of course, it started with behaviorism and cognitive science. Then later, there has been the attempt to find a way, indirect way, to study experience. And first intuition was, well, if I just stick to what people report, that's objective data. I can study that. I can, it's intersubjective, it's measurable, it's quantitative. I think that's all fine in the sense that it is a good source of data. But this paper points out that we shouldn't forget that phenomenology is a good source of data too. And I like a lot the quote from the last, I think it's the very last section, that is connecting the dots, vision, phenomenal, and functional, that basically says there are, when we see something, there's a lot going on that is really not functional at all. Most of what we experience is phenomenal structure with no functional counterpart. If you imagine just sitting and watching a movie where every snapshot, every frame is just a lot of colors on the paper, there's no objects, there's nothing to do for you, just sit there. They're so fast that you just see them, but you can't even retain in memory. Nobody asked them to notice anything, to report anything. There's really little that functionally you would say you are doing, and there's very little that you can report. And yet it seems absurd, if you have an experience of that situation, to say that there isn't a lot of structure and a lot of richness going on. You're seeing a lot of images that are all different from each other, and you can see all of the details changing all the time. So I think the claim is not that reporting and reportability is not a good source of data, but it is that we shouldn't commit the fallacy of saying that that's all we can study. And I also want to point out that Francesco was one of the first authors of a paper published in 2021 called Consciousness and the Fallacy of Misplaced Objectivity, that basically harps on this point. I don't know if you want to add something.
I think you got the main gist of it. Exactly, the point is not to demonize behavioral or functional or even neural evidence. Of course, actually, these are crucial to understand consciousness, obviously. But we always need to keep in mind that what we want to study, what we want to explain, is subjective experience. And therefore, there is no escape but take subjective experience into account. And so the fallacy, as we called it in the paper, and by the way, Matteo is a co-author of the paper, and also I would like to mention Jeremiah Hendren. But the main point of that paper is exactly like we call the fallacy of misplaced objectivity, when researchers believe that subjective experience, by its subjective nature or whatever other reason, it cannot be tackled scientifically, and therefore it should be outside or at the very extreme periphery of the picture, and we should only take into account the objective and extrinsic measurable features, or its functional, behavioral, or neural correlates. And again, this is we believe this is a radical mistake, because if you're doing that, then you're not necessarily doing consciousness science, but you are doing something else, which might be very important, but does not answer the question you wanted to answer in the first place.
Thank you. That's a fantastic answer to my question.
If I may now, maybe if we move to another kind of aspect of the paper, Something I have a question of is like, I find the way, are we to interpret these levels of what we're sort of seeing as discrete levels, or rather sort of continuous spectrum? So I think in this paper, they're kind of established as sort of discrete levels, lower, medium, high. And I find it quite like, I feel like I can imagine things that exist between them. Or I think the example that is given in the figure relating to the kind of colored splotches versus the decorated living room. The case is kind of made, I believe, in the paper that like the splatters don't evoke any high level categories for like, I think what they say is typical observers. Because there's not, you know, when we're deciding on specific sort of discrete levels, like how can we make this kind of claim that like this doesn't give any higher level? What if I'm a modern artist or a contemporary artist, and I live in a relatively Spartan apartment every day, and I paint in splotches and splatters? You know, maybe my lived experience makes me better at discerning or finding more memorable things in these colored splotches than the typical observer. Does that mean that we can kind of graduate things out of these lower levels to higher levels depending on the way we experience them? Or is things sort of distinguishably discrete? I mean, just as a thought.
This is an excellent question. I would like to comment on that briefly. So I agree with you that there's a sense in which the two cases, the living room and the splatters, are maybe less different than presented. But I want to say that I still believe the levels are discrete. And I'll tell you why. So I completely agree with you that technically in the way in which IIT approaches the explanation of low-level features and then groupings and then objects of which you can then, you know, that you can then use to give high-level description, is actually kind of discrete in the sense that the idea is that mechanistically in the substrate of consciousness, the low-level features such as colors and differences in brightness are probably contributed by something like, I don't know, double opponent cells and single opponent cells, some mechanisms that just specify color somewhere in the visual field, but then, and so on and so forth for maybe edges. But then the moment you start having groupings, this is a different type of mechanism that may perform some sort of invariance function where you can say, I can start recognizing a triangle and I see it as a triangle no matter the orientation, no matter if it is here or there, or if it's big or if it's different color. So even the groupings and the things that in this paper are called groupings, actually, they're a discrete level above, let's say, the low-level features, but they're more continuous to more complex objects. So there are at least these differences in having low-level features and then some form of invariance, grouping, or object that to me is relevant to call it a discrete, you know, these are different things and probably they're implemented by different architectures. And we believe pure space, so the structure of space is contributed by mostly grids or lattices of units with lateral connections. Low-level features are contributed by probably cliques of neurons that are highly interconnected inside, and then this idea of invariance is contributed by convergent architectures, pyramidal structures, like the ones in the ventral stream of visual cortex. However, I agree with you, and from what I just said is very intuitive now that suddenly you can have concepts about many different things, and you can see objects, you can see groupings and invariance, even in the case of the splatters. If you are a Jackson Pollock connoisseur or, you know, like an art expert, you might immediately, you know, see more memorable and even have high-level descriptions of some things that from some other people would be very abstract and they wouldn't have a concept or a term for. So in a sense, there is more continuity. It's just some objects are more recognizable because we're exposed to it, like living rooms or natural scenes. Some of them might even be hardwired, like a face, but some might be acquired, like you say. So yeah.
if
So-
I can build.
Oh, I was going to say, is I feel like I agree with you, that there's this some are more continuous than others. I mean, I'd certainly say like that things are definitely higher or lower. Like, I get to a point, and yes, that's definitely a group. And then we have our kind of high level concepts. It's just like finding where one starts and the other ends. I find like in this difficult. Now, maybe there is, if we look deeper, but even in your description, that as you've been saying, like for some things that are just more continuously discretely continuous, like we're kind of one way or the other. I guess it's more an interesting sort of thought. I like the idea that it's supported somehow neurally. And then I suppose if you have a different sort of lived experience, your brain is somewhat plastic in that way. That would contribute to this different grouping in some way we can imagine, maybe. But what were you going to say as well?
Yeah, I wanted to say that, yeah, I think your question actually was very good and actually very on point, because ultimately, when we study consciousness, certainly we're interested into questions that are to a certain level general, but ultimately consciousness, in virtue of being subjective, it will be your experience, my experience, someone else's experience, right? So, for example, in the picture on the left, picture B on the left, I can vaguely see kind of a small horse, like a not very well defined, right? And you know, like this could be something like that maybe other people don't see or don't feel, and whatever. But this, I think, it's really something extremely important, and also like something that I really appreciated of this paper, because it conveys quite clearly the idea. And so an example that helped me to understand this idea, like how meaning relates to visual experience, is, for example, to think about like imagine there are two chessboards and three people, right? One is a complete beginner, another one is an intermediate player, and then there is I don't know, international grandmaster of chess, right? And on the two chessboards, there are two very different configurations, right? And so imagine, like, for the beginner, the chessboards, they're clearly different. Like, you can discriminate that the pieces are arranged in different slots, but it kind of hand there, you know, like you cannot say, oh, white is winning or black is winning, or there's, you know, but for the intermediate player, maybe there will be some kind of understanding, like rather maybe even complex on, let's say, on the first board, and maybe a little bit more confusion on the second board. And then the grandmaster will say, we'll have a very clear intuition on how the game is playing on the first board, and it will be able to tell you just at a glance that on the second board, the configuration is impossible. It's not a configuration you can obtain by playing an actual game of chess, right? So, and you see, but the low-level features are exactly the same. Like, the pieces didn't move an inch when the three different people were looking at them. But in virtue of having a different, as you were saying, different repertoire of experiences and knowledge, in a sense, the meaning of that visual experience can be radically different and can be open very different avenues. So I think yeah, it's a very important point you raised.
Yeah, that's a great thought. Really, I like that. It's a nice way to think about it. Yeah.
And also, your point of, you know, something being continuous versus it being discrete is my understanding of this continuity seems to come from like over time, right? But I guess what this paper or IIT in general likes to look at is like any instant of experience. You either have that concept over there or you don't. But over time, maybe, you know, you start to see the concept, and then at some point early in your life, you don't. So yeah.
Yeah, I guess
And
it's just
I
Oh, sorry. I guess phenomenologically, it's almost impossible to have an instant experience, like an experience at an instant. Just Well, maybe, but like it's
Yeah,
hard to get that.
they're looking at it. They're looking at it. They have a time paper as well.
Well, I
There we
mean,
go. Ask and you shall
what we
receive.
mean, yeah, what we mean by an instant of experience is the shortest possible,
Yes.
moment of consciousness that you can say, oh yes, I've seen a figure before anything changed, before I had any thought about it. It was just like that little snapshot of an experience, not an instant in the sense of an experience that lasts a picosecond in clock time or physical. No, not like that. Yeah.
But it's also
Yeah,
like
yeah,
a
of course.
system too. Right. If that instant, I mean, it's like a state of the system.
Yes. No, I follow you. I think maybe it's just also like I think maybe it's a thing in the consciousness field more broadly. So as we are talking about something so intrinsic and private and kind of personal, that when we have to do the science thing of being like, here is a typical experience taken from X number of people in order to sort of get some statistical power, it immediately feels, at least in instances like this, quite unsatisfying, because it's like, well, you could easily imagine individual people who would have a radically different experience based on their intrinsic private nature that is not adequately captured when you're trying to get statistics, or you're trying to build a kind of average consensus.
Yeah, definitely. That's why, in this kind of visual experiments, we now like to use this really generic natural scene that everybody will see in their everyday life. So to minimize this kind of drastic individual variance in seeing a particular stimulus.
Yeah, because it's just so difficult to control for the inner mental world.
Yeah.
I also want to maybe just mention something terminological, but I think it's important when in this paper and in other papers in general, IIT talks about the structure of experience. Like Qianchen said, it always means the structure of a specific experience of a person at a specific time. It doesn't mean that experience in general, every possible experience falls within the structure of all possible experiences with all possible contents, because there's some sort of intersubjective structure of experience that characterizes at large human consciousness. I mean, maybe we can generalize from a lot of instances and then draw conclusions about the structure of human experience. But in this case, what we mean is that for a specific individual with their specific, neural setup to see a scene with an object like a face on the screen, it means that if this person is seeing the face, it must mean that they are seeing some groupings of low-level features bound to space. Another person might not be seeing the face because they have prosopagnosia, but still they might be seeing the groupings and the low-level features. Some other person might be, seeing differently. So it's very important to describe a specific experience as a structure and then address that point in terms of some physical explanation connected to the substrate, but that's an individual's experience. Yeah.
Just to briefly extend one of the previous discussion, I sort of have an idea regarding because some of these higher level concepts, they can be acquired, they can be learned. And according to what Matteo said, it seems like we are expecting them to be reflected in the neurophysiology of the brain. Can we just teach a bunch of normal adults a new concept? Well, make them be able to identify a new visual object and observe the changes in their brain from the beginning to the end. And would that be able to tell us more about conscious visual experience? Will that be an interesting idea, or is it not really feasible?
I think it's a very interesting idea. Definitely, there's a lot of fertile ground to study concepts and their neural implementation, also with new techniques. Like now we have, more accurate neuroimaging techniques and stimulating techniques, and we have neuropixel, we have all sorts of things. So I'm not an expert on the neuroscience, but I can just mention two cases that might be interesting for you. One is that, well, clearly we can teach new concepts to people. This happens every time. but you can also see some famous experiments like the one where people were exposed to some shapes, and they were told, I think, that some of them were types we would call some shapes kiki and some shapes booba, and they were like asked to associate these shapes to these names. And clearly, these are new concepts that come with some baggage. Some of these names might be suggestive also of more like round shapes, and some of my more like spiky shapes. But then very quickly, people learn these things. I am in Japan right now, and I quickly learned that there's a very noticeable difference between katakana and hiragana characters. At the beginning, they just look like scribbles to me, but now if I see one, I'm like, oh, I don't remember which katakana, but this is clearly a katakana, right? It's just a family resemblance of characters. So you can learn new concepts quickly. And actually, we know from some studies from, for instance, Parvizi's lab that and other neuroscientists that study FFA and concept cells, that if you are lucky enough to have patients with electrodes that are implanted in the right areas where you can record from concept cells, you can actually see online the formation of the tip of the pyramid of a concept. So you can see that some cells are firing for nothing specific at the beginning. And then there was an example where a population of cells started its firing started to correlate with every time the patient saw the face of the neurologist that was treating him. So it became more and more specialized and attuned to this very, very specific stimulus that it was the face of the doctor under any possible circumstance. And at the beginning of the treatment, it wasn't so selective. So you can find population of concept cells that basically get specialized for a specific invariant, in this case, a face. And in principle, you could also try to record activity of concept cells and try to teach things to subjects to see online how their receptive field and what they're attuned to gets more specific with time. And you can also design other experiments with stimulation, inhibition, maybe trying to cause temporary concept agnosia by inhibiting cells that you know are specialized for some specific concepts. So very fertile ground for the future.
Unfortunately. Do we have any other? Oh, sorry.
Well, actually, it's not that related to this richness paper itself, but
Oh,
maybe we can talk about it afterwards. Yeah, it's not related to this richness paper itself.
We are at our hour. We can keep going.
Okay, I'm gonna ask. So on this, emergence of concept, I'm not sure if you guys like the idea, like the term of emergence, but it seems to me that concepts can be emergent in the way you defined it. But do you think, would you take into account like how concepts emerge not from just like, oh, like low-level features, intermediate features, and suddenly you have an extra layer, but would it be more likely for a single concept to emerge because you have all the other alternatives, and then you suddenly know, oh, they are kind of different from the others, and then so this is this single concept emerge as differentiable from the others. For example, when you see like the splatters, and then you're like Jackson Pollock fan, then they may use words like gesture to describe. And the reason why every gesture concept is kind of distinctive is because you can distinguish it from some other things. I shouldn't have mentioned that.
It's a very interesting question. It's a very complicated one. I'm not sure, but maybe I can just add one thing that might get to the idea, which is, I think there are different ways in which you can learn new concepts. Some are just by addition, like basically when I was learning hiragana and katakana, these are things I've never seen before, and I've seen them one at a time, and I would add, you know, one character at a time and start to memorize it and then recognize it, right? So this feels more like adding one, and in a sense also after I had some of them, I would also know, oh, these are all katakana. So it's more like I generalize from a set of characters. I understand that these are part of a class. But you can also learn concepts by, instead of going in the generalization direction, you can go in the specification direction. So for instance, you can imagine when you start drinking wine, for instance, you can try different wines and they all taste like red wine. But then if you focus your attention and you start dissecting the experience of each individual wine, you can actually notice there's more structure in every single experience, right? And you can start noticing one is more, I don't know, tannic than the other, one is a little fruitier. And it seems like before you just have one concept that is red wine taste, and then you refine it and you actually create more concepts by making it more specific. I don't know if this was one. You see a Pollock and then you see the first phase of Pollock, second phase of Pollock, because the gesture changes and becomes more refined. Yeah, I think there's both directions of learning new concepts, definitely.
If there's no more questions, I think we will just end it here. Any?
Not from me.
No? All right. Great. Thanks for coming again. Hope you have enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, great chat.
All right. I'll stop sharing. Well, next time. Bye-bye.
And can we just remind everyone interested in IIT that there is an online wiki made by Matteo and his colleagues, iit.wiki. And so if you're interested in IIT and related topics, you can check that out. I'm making advertisement because Matteo is not.
Yeah, there is also a part on accounting for contents of experience, and there is a section on space. Hopefully there will be a section on concepts and objects very soon, and also on the empirical validation. So it's a work in progress. Of course, we're trying to expand it, but everything that comes out as a paper eventually will be discussed also in the wiki. Thank you for reminding everybody.
The link will be down below. So go and have a look. A lot of people spend a lot of time on it. So go. All right. Bye-bye.